June 1944. A narrow hedgerow lane outside St. Lo lies silent under the weight of early morning fog. Dew clings to the steel plates of a Panzer IV as its engine rumbles softly, its crew alert but calm. For weeks they have pushed through Normandy expecting mines, artillery, or anti-tank guns. Nothing an experienced crew hasn't seen before. The tank eases forward, crushing branches beneath its tracks. Then, an instant of white flash. A sharp metallic crack slams through the hull. The loader freezes. The driver shouts. Heat blooms across the interior. A jet of molten metal, thin as a needle, punches through the side armor and sprays the turret wall in glowing fragments. The crew has no idea what hit them. No artillery, no mine, no cannon blast. Just a sudden burst that seemed to melt through armor in a single second. Outside, hidden behind tangled hedgerows, two American infantrymen lower a strange tube-shaped weapon the Germans have scarcely encountered. Smoke drifts from its back blast as they slip into the foliage once more. Inside the burning Panzer, the stunned crew confronts the terrifying reality of a weapon they never expected. A weapon already spreading across the battlefield. The shock that rippled through German armored units in 1944 did not begin on the hedgerows of Normandy. Its origins stretched back years earlier, rooted in a fundamental imbalance that plagued Allied infantry from the opening days of the war. By 1940, and even more so by 1942, the German army had perfected the integration of fast-moving armor with mechanized infantry and close air support. Panzer divisions were not just armored forces. They were instruments of rapid, focused, overwhelming momentum. Against them, ordinary riflemen had limited answers. In North Africa, British, Australian, and American troops learned this firsthand. Infantry anti-tank rifles bounced harmlessly off even medium German armor. Small anti-tank guns worked only at dangerously close range. Most infantry units had to rely on cumbersome guns that required towing, setup, and open exposure. As German tanks grew heavier, the imbalance grew worse. By 1942, the U.S. Army understood the problem clearly. Infantry needed a lightweight, portable anti-tank weapon, something fast, simple, and powerful enough to stop a tank without field artillery. Research had already begun before America entered the war, but now it intensified. Engineers refined the idea of a shoulder-fired launch tube combined with a shaped-charge warhead. The same principle German and Soviet engineers were studying. The shaped charge, also called a heat, high-explosive anti-tank warhead, did not rely on velocity. Instead, it used chemical energy to produce a superheated jet capable of piercing armor far thicker than the explosive size suggested. When it struck steel, it didn't melt armor by heat alone. It forced a thin stream of metal inward under extreme pressure, creating the terrifying impression of armor dissolving. In late 1942, the first practical American version of this idea appeared. The M1 rocket launcher, quickly nicknamed the Bazooka because its odd tubular shape reminded soldiers of a comedian's improvised musical instrument. It was crude, it was simple, but it worked. The Bazooka's debut came in North Africa in early 1943, though supply was limited. Crews struggled with reliability, wiring issues, and inconsistent rockets. Still, when it fired correctly, it shocked German crews. The warhead's penetrating jet could slice through the side armor of most Panzer III and Panzer IV variants, vehicles that had dominated European campaigns with confidence. For the first time, U.S. infantrymen had a weapon that could be carried on foot, concealed easily, and fired from ambush positions. Yet the weapon's early battlefield performance remained uneven. In Sicily, some rockets failed to detonate. Humidity and storage problems weakened the ignition system. Many U.S. soldiers hesitated to use it against tanks, unsure of its reliability. Even so, German reports began to appear, noting mysterious armor perforations from handheld weapons. But the scale was limited. The bazooka had not yet entered its decisive phase. As 1943 progressed, American engineers refined design flaws. By the time Allied troops prepared for Italy and, later, for the invasion of France, new variants like the M9 and M9A1 addressed many earlier issues. These launchers featured improved sights, sturdier wiring, and more reliable rockets. Production surged. For the first time, entire infantry units could field multiple bazookas, giving platoons the ability to form dedicated anti-armor teams. Meanwhile, German armor doctrine evolved toward heavier tanks, a direct response to facing more powerful enemy weapons across the Eastern Front. The Panzer IV received thicker frontal armor. The Panther introduced highly sloped plating. Yet these improvements focused on resisting traditional kinetic penetrators, bullets, shells, and solid shot. Few German commanders anticipated the growing danger of chemical energy warheads carried by small teams of infantry operating in terrain that negated a tank's long-range advantage. The stage was set for a confrontation neither side fully understood. American infantry now had the first widely available, effective, lightweight anti-tank weapon of the war. German tank crews, long accustomed to dominating infantry in close quarters, had never seen anything like it. And in the battlefields of Italy and the hedgerow labyrinths of France, these two forces would collide. A weapon once viewed as an experiment would soon alter the psychology of armored warfare. By the time Allied troops advanced through Italy in late 1943, German tank commanders began encountering battlefield reports that did not fit earlier patterns. Infantry ambushes, once considered a nuisance more than a threat, were causing armor losses without the presence of known anti-tank guns. Crews described armor plates pierced by a narrow, almost perfectly circular hole, edges burned and curled inward. Some believed the damage came from new British explosives. Others suspected underground mines detonated at improbable angles. Only a few understood the reality. A handheld launcher firing a shaped charge rocket. German armor doctrine had long emphasized maintaining distance from concealed infantry, especially in towns or broken terrain. But even well-trained crews struggled in Italy's steep valleys, stone villages, and tight passes. Tanks could not maneuver freely. Infantry's support lagged behind in rubble-choked streets. Ambush angles multiplied, and with the bazooka now widely fielded, small U.S. teams could strike from windows, courtyards, terraces, or steep embankments. In these conditions, the psychological gap widened. American infantry, once wary of engaging tanks at close range, now had a weapon that rewarded patience, positioning, and terrain familiarity. German tankers, who historically relied on the belief that infantry lacked the means to penetrate their armor without heavy equipment, found themselves vulnerable in every direction. By 1944, as the Allies prepared for Operation Overlord, the bazooka had matured into a reliable battlefield presence. Entire airborne divisions received large supplies for use during the Normandy landings. Armored infantry units trained extensively in anti-tank ambush tactics, learning to use hedgerows, ditches, and farm structures as natural firing positions. Meanwhile, German armored forces faced increasing strategic pressure. The Eastern Front consumed material and manpower. Panzer divisions deployed in France often operated with mixed vehicle types and limited fuel. Tank crews arriving in Normandy were well-trained but frequently underinformed about new Allied weapons. Briefing materials focused on anti-tank guns, mines, and anti-armor grenades. The idea that American infantry possessed a compact rocket launcher capable of defeating even late-war Panzer IV variants was barely mentioned. When the first Panthers arrived in France, many crews believed their angled frontal armor made them nearly immune to infantry weapons. In open terrain, this was partly true. But Normandy was not open terrain. The hedgerow country, bocage, transformed every field into a fortress. A tank's greatest advantage, long-range firepower, became irrelevant inside 5-meter-wide lanes flanked by thick earth banks. Turret traverse became restricted, vision impaired, and maneuvering hazardous. Every corner concealed a possible firing position. In these narrow corridors, bazooka teams found the perfect battlefield. German field reports from June and July 1944 reveal an emerging pattern. Tanks struck at close range, often from the sides or rear, with damage far greater than expected from small arms. Some reports used vague descriptions like burning penetrations, hole with melted rim, or violent internal spalling. Others speculated about a British or American copy of the German Panzerfaust, unaware that the bazooka had existed since 1942. Fear began to spread among armored units. Veteran tankers understood that a crew's survivability depended heavily on confidence. Confidence in the machine, confidence in the armor, confidence in the ability to withdraw safely. But the bazooka eroded that confidence. A tank could be destroyed without warning, from a weapon no larger than a shovel. In the bocage, a panzer crew might not detect the threat until the moment of impact. The weapon's proliferation accelerated. Within weeks of the Normandy landings, nearly every American platoon could field multiple launchers. Rangers, airborne troops, armored infantry, and engineer units all integrated bazooka teams into their standard defensive and offensive tactics. For German tank commanders, this meant the threat was no longer occasional. It was constant. In this evolving battlefield environment, the bazooka did more than damage steel. It reshaped the psychological landscape of armored warfare. And that shift would open the way for deeper angles, technological, human, tactical, and strategic, behind the bazooka's stunning impact. German tank crews often believed the bazooka melted armor because its impact looked like a burn more than a blast. In reality, the bazooka's warhead used a principle that had been studied for decades, but never fully appreciated on the battlefield: the shaped charge effect. Inside the warhead sat a hollow cone of metal, often copper, designed to focus explosive force into a single, ultra-concentrated jet. Upon impact, the explosive detonated and collapsed the cone inward at tremendous speed. This produced a thin jet that behaved like a liquid stream of metal, though it was not molten in the traditional sense. The pressure was so great that it sliced through armor by forcing itself into the steel, driving inward with temperatures high enough to glow, but powered primarily by pressure, not heat. To a German crew examining the aftermath, the result was startling. A small entry hole with edges curled inward, interior spalling, glowing metal fragments, and in some cases fires sparked by superheated residue. It was unlike anything produced by traditional kinetic penetrators. The bazooka's technology was simple enough for mass production, yet advanced enough to challenge even Germany's newest armor. And for crews accustomed to thick plates that had survived Soviet anti-tank rifles, British boys' guns, and early artillery hits, this sudden technological leap felt almost unnatural. What they saw as melting was, in truth, physics far ahead of the battlefield's expectations. For German tankers, survival depended heavily on trust. Trust in their machine, trust in their armor, and trust in their training. The Panzer Force prided itself on discipline, engineering, and battlefield experience. But the Bazooka's arrival disrupted that stability in ways that statistics alone cannot convey. Inside a tank, the world shrinks to a dim, cramped compartment of metal walls and narrow vision. The crew hears more than they see. They feel vibrations through the hull. They rely on instinct and the belief that their armor can endure whatever the enemy throws at them. When reports emerged of tanks struck from close range by a small handheld weapon, many crews dismissed them. When those same crews experienced a shaped charge hit, that dismissiveness vanished instantly. Survivors described a sudden, piercing flash, a spray of glowing fragments, the rapid ignition of stowed equipment, and the instinctive panic of trying to escape through tight hatches before smoke and flame filled the compartment. Crews began to fear silence. Quiet hedgerows, abandoned buildings, tree lines, rubble piles. Anything could hide a bazooka team. Crews started traversing turrets constantly, firing at suspected ambush sites, and refusing to move without extensive infantry screens. But infantry support was often insufficient, especially in Normandy's dense terrain. The human impact was clear. The bazooka changed German tanker behavior not just tactically, but psychologically. The battlefield felt more dangerous, more unpredictable, more intimate. And for crewmen trained to dominate engagement from distance, that shift was deeply unsettling. The bazooka was not merely a weapon. It was an amplifier of terrain. Its effectiveness skyrocketed when used in landscapes that restricted a tank's line of sight and movement. In Sicily's rocky passes, Italy's hill towns, and especially Normandy's bocage, U.S. infantry quickly realized they could shape tactical engagements the moment they controlled firing angles. A tank excelled in open fields, but in hedgerows, a tank was a blind giant. Bazooka teams exploited this by positioning themselves where tanks could neither see nor traverse their turrets quickly. The ideal strike came from 10 to 40 meters, a range that would terrify any infantryman facing a tank, but which became manageable when armed with a weapon that required only a clear shot at the side or rear plating. American units adapted rapidly. Platoons assigned two-man bazooka teams to overwatch positions. Engineers cleared firing ports in hedgerows. Infantry coordinated ambushes with machine gun fire to bait tanks into predictable lanes. In towns, teams positioned themselves in doorways, behind heavy stone walls, or inside upper-floor rooms that tanks could not elevate their guns to hit. The weapon did not simply give infantry a way to kill tanks. It gave them the ability to control where tanks could move, forcing them to hesitate, reroute, or halt entirely. By combining the bazooka with terrain, U.S. infantry turned landscapes that once favored tanks into lethal traps. The tactical balance shifted, and German armor doctrine, built on speed, firepower, and maneuver, found itself constrained at every turn. By mid-1944, the German High Command understood that its armored units were no longer fighting on familiar terms. The bazooka didn't just threaten individual tanks. It threatened Germany's ability to maneuver. Before its arrival in large numbers, German armored doctrine operated on a reliable truth. Infantry rarely possessed the means to stop tanks unless supported by heavy guns. This allowed German panzers to spearhead assaults, probe defenses, and counterattack rapidly. But as shaped charge weapons spread across Allied forces, German planners faced an uncomfortable reality. Even small infantry units could now stop or delay armored movements. Operational maps that once highlighted artillery positions and anti-tank gun lines now had to consider every piece of terrain that might conceal bazooka teams. Tank counterattacks slowed. Recon elements hesitated before pushing into villages or wooded areas. Some panzer commanders refused to advance without overwhelming infantry numbers, resources that were rarely available in 1944. In Normandy, the impact was immediate. Tank units that should have maneuvered fluidly through the bocage became pinned or bottlenecked. Panther battalions, designed to engage enemy armor at long range, found themselves trapped in short-range duels against infantry with bazookas. Even Tiger units, whose thick armor inspired near invulnerability, adopted cautious movement patterns, relying more on careful observation and infantry coordination than on bold armored thrusts. At the strategic level, the bazooka contributed to the overall fragmentation of German armored mobility. Tanks became assets to be preserved, not exploited. Decisions that once favored rapid armored response now required rethinking. The danger was no longer limited to the enemy's guns. It was woven into the landscape itself. For a military machine built on decisive armored action, this quiet shift was devastating. While German crews were stunned by the bazooka in 1943 and 1944, Germany itself had developed two of the most formidable infantry anti-tank weapons of the war, the Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck. Both emerged later than the bazooka, but both offered greater raw penetration. The Panzerfaust was a disposable, single-shot launcher firing a warhead far more powerful than the bazookas. Its penetration could exceed 200 millimeters of armor, enough to defeat virtually any tank of the era. The Panzerfaust required no complex handling, making it effective even in the hands of poorly trained troops. The Panzerschreck, heavily inspired by the American bazooka, was a larger, shielded launcher that fired an 88 millimeters rocket. Its penetration was superior, and its psychological effect on Allied crews mirrored the fear German crews felt. However, neither German weapon erased the bazooka's advantages during its critical phase in Normandy and Italy. The bazooka gained influence earlier and in far larger numbers. It reached frontline infantry during pivotal operations when German armor still held strategic value. And unlike Germany's late war weapons, which arrived when resources, fuel, and manpower were collapsing, the bazooka entered battle when the U.S. Army supply system was at full strength. In essence, the bazooka reshaped the battlefield at a moment when Germany could least afford new challenges. The Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck would go on to terrify Allied tankers, but the bazooka achieved something more subtle. It changed how German armor fought and how confident it felt. Months before Germany's own infantry rockets appeared in comparable numbers, German tanks were respected, feared, and technologically advanced. But their vulnerabilities to shaped charge weapons were real, and the bazooka exploited them ruthlessly. Panzer IVs had side armor as thin as 30 millimeters. Panthers had a superb front plate, but a notoriously weak flank, only 40 to 50 millimeters thick and positioned vertically, perfect for shaped charge penetration. Even the Tiger I, with its massive armor, had rear and side plates vulnerable to chemical energy jets when struck at close range. Nor were these weaknesses limited to armor thickness. German tanks carried ammunition racks along interior walls, suspended fuel lines, exposed cooling grills, and ventilation ports that could ignite when struck by superheated fragments. A shaped charge penetration that pierced even a non-critical area often generated secondary effects, fires, ammunition cook-offs, or spalling, that could render a tank inoperable. In the confined spaces of Normandy, these vulnerabilities multiplied. Tanks could rarely angle their armor optimally. Ambushes came from above and below, from hedgerow banks and roadside ditches. For a shaped charge, The angle of impact mattered far less than the weapon's ability to deliver a focus jet. When German crews later inspected wrecked vehicles, the pattern was unmistakable. Small, round entry holes, severe internal fragmentation, scorched interior surfaces, burned or ruptured ammunition, rapid, uncontrollable fire spread. These were not the familiar scars of anti-tank guns or artillery. They were the signature of a weapon that penetrated armor through physics rather than force. And for tankers trained to trust their steel, that discovery felt like betrayal. The turning point arrived in the summer of 1944, when the shock of individual bazooka ambushes evolved into a decisive and measurable impact on German armored operations. Nowhere was this more evident than in the dense, claustrophobic battlefields of the Normandy bocage, where narrow lanes and earth-walled hedgerows shaped every maneuver. In late June, as the Allies pushed inland from the beaches, German commanders attempted a series of local counterattacks intended to isolate American units before they could fully consolidate. Panzer Division, 2nd Panzer Division, and elements of the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division were ordered to blunt U.S. advances near St. Lo, Corentin, and the Vire River line. These counterattacks depended on armored thrusts, short, violent pushes designed to push American infantry back on their lines and slow the Allied breakout. But the moment German tanks entered the hedgerows, the rhythm changed. A Panther advancing down a dirt lane near La Mauve was the first to report what would become a repeating event. The tank led a column of Panzer Grenadiers on foot, attempting to clear a route toward American defensive positions. As it rounded a bend, infantry movement on the left drew its attention. The Panther's turret swung to cover the suspected threat. That was the moment a bazooka team hidden in the right side hedgerow fired. The rocket hit the Panther's side plate just behind the road wheels, a known vulnerability zone. The shaped charge jet sliced through the armor, ruptured a fuel line, and sent a spray of burning vapor across the fighting compartment. The tank came to an immediate halt, its commander struggling to escape the turret as flames surged upward. Behind it, the rest of the column hesitated. The infantry scrambled for cover, but were pinned by American machine gun fire from concealed positions. The loss of a single Panther, struck by a weapon the Germans still underestimated, forced the entire counterattack to stall. This pattern repeated across the sector. German units attempted to push forward in small armored groups, only to be met by concentrated bazooka ambushes. U.S. infantry, now thoroughly trained in hedgerow tactics, coordinated fires with remarkable efficiency. One squad would suppress German infantry with rifles and machine guns while bazooka teams maneuvered into position. Others waited in concealed pits or undercut firing slits carved into the banks themselves. German tank commanders reported that no lane, orchard, or hedgerow approach was safe. The true turning point came during the preparatory fights leading to Operation Cobra, the American breakout from Normandy. Cobra required U.S. infantry to advance through some of the most constricted terrain in the region. Tanks could not breach the hedgerows without specialized engineering devices, and even then, they remained vulnerable to close-range Panzerfaust teams. What turned the balance was the sheer density of bazooka-equipped American squads. During engagements west of St. Lo, company commanders noted that every time German armor attempted to counterattack, bazooka fire erupted from multiple angles. Ambushes were no longer isolated acts, but systematic layers of anti-tank defense woven directly into infantry lines. A German Panzer IV battle group advancing toward the village of Lut Desert encountered this new defensive architecture in full. As the first tank approached the village outskirts, its commander spotted an abandoned farmhouse and ordered high-explosive shells fired into it. Standard anti-ambush procedure. But the Bazooka team was not inside the building. They were lying prone in a trench cut directly into the hedgerow, nearly invisible beneath foliage. Their shot struck the Panzer IV at less than 25 meters. The tank lurched, smoke streaking from the rear plate. The second Panzer forswung its turret wildly, firing into the hedgerow, but its round buried itself in the earth bank. Two more Bazooka rockets streaked from another angle, hitting the turret ring and track guard. In 30 seconds, the lead elements of the counterattack were disabled. The remaining German infantry, now lacking tank support, were forced to withdraw under small arms and mortar fire. Reports from the unit later described the area as a death box, with every lane offering a potential hidden strike. The psychological effect was severe. Crews felt they were being hunted by unseen threats that could kill them instantly. By early July, it was evident to both sides that the bazooka was no longer a mere support weapon. It had become a battlefield equalizer. American infantry, often advancing without significant armored support of their own, now possessed a tool that allowed them to fight German panzers on more equal terms. German doctrine, built on rapid armored exploitation, found itself repeatedly disrupted. The ability to push through infantry lines depended on maintaining momentum. But momentum vanished the moment a single bazooka round penetrated the lead vehicle. Columns stopped. Plans stalled. Counterattacks collapsed. American officers noted that as long as they could defend the flanks and hold tight hedgerow positions, the bazooka could protect them from the most feared vehicles on the battlefield. For German tank crews, the turning point came with a grim realization. Their armor was no longer the decisive power it had once been. And as the Allies prepared for the full force of Operation Cobra, this shift in battlefield psychology and capability would collide with the final breaking point of German armored confidence. The reports arriving at German armored headquarters during the winter of 1944 painted a picture far more alarming than the tactical anecdotes coming out of the Western Front. The Panzertruppen were not merely losing tanks. They were losing the psychological dominance that had defined them since 1939. The Panzerwaffe had always relied on a critical advantage, the belief, shared by friend and foe alike, that German armor was nearly unstoppable at close range. But now, from the bocage lanes of Normandy to the ruined villages of the Hürtgen forest, that belief was collapsing. And whenever German officers attempted to understand why engagements were suddenly turning against them at shockingly short distances, the same word kept appearing in frontline reports. The German Army High Command initially dismissed the weapon as an American novelty, something carried more for morale than real lethality. But as captured intelligence poured in, destroyed Panthers inspected, combat analysis photographed, and testimonies from shaken crews documented, it became clear that this novelty was systematically degrading Panzer operations. The Americans' M1A1 and later M9 launchers used a principle Germany knew well but had underestimated: the shaped charge warhead, capable of focusing explosive energy into a narrow jet that cut through steel by sheer pressure and heat. German crews, who had long trusted in the thickness of their armor, now faced something they could not counter with maneuver or distance. In the confines of forests, towns, and hedge-lined roads, the bazooka functioned as a force multiplier far out of proportion to its size. It wasn't just the penetrations. The weapon forced a fundamental tactical shift upon the panzer divisions. Commanders found themselves rewriting engagement protocols. Tanks could no longer linger near infantry strongpoints. Machine gunners had to sweep suspected hiding places before armor advanced. Engineers were tasked with clearing buildings ahead of every movement. Even a mighty Tiger II crews, who once operated with a sense of invulnerability, started to rely heavily on supporting infantry screens in environments where bazookas could be concealed within a few feet. The fragile equilibrium between German armor and Allied infantry tilted decisively. American units, realizing how effective the weapon truly was, began distributing bazookas in larger numbers. Rifle platoons integrated anti-tank teams more systematically. Airborne units used them to compensate for their lack of heavy equipment. Armored infantry used them as both anti-tank and bunker-breaking tools. For German tankers, the cumulative effect was corrosive. Veterans who had survived years of frontline combat wrote candidly in their reports that their greatest fear was no longer enemy armor or artillery. It was the silent figure hidden behind a corner at a range of 10 meters. One Panther commander from the 2nd Panzer Division wrote that the bazooka forced us to fight blind, never knowing where the next shot would come from. This psychological shift mattered greatly, because the Panzer arm relied not just on engineering excellence, but on the confidence and aggressiveness of its crews. Anything that caused hesitation, even momentary, disrupted the combined arms harmony that German doctrine was built upon. By early 1945, the German High Command finally acknowledged what frontline units had already understood. The bazooka had become a strategic threat, not just a tactical one. Efforts to rush countermeasures, including improvised side skirts, expanded use of spaced armor, and even attempts to replicate or respond with domestic rocket launchers, came far too late. Germany produced the Ofenrohr and Panzerschreck, but shortages of materials, the collapse of supply chains, and the overwhelming pressure on all fronts made widespread deployment nearly impossible compared to the American capacity to field bazookas in huge quantities. On the ground, the imbalance was unmistakable. American infantry, advancing village by village, carried a weapon that cost a fraction of a Panther's road wheel, yet could neutralize it in a single shot. German tank units, already strained by fuel shortages and mechanical attrition, were being undone by a 6-pound launcher and a warhead that fit in a soldier's pack. And as the war entered its final, devastating months, German tank commanders began to understand that the age of heavy armored dominating infantry by fear alone was ending, replaced by a battlefield where small, portable, scientifically designed weapons could destroy even the most feared machines of war. The collapse of armored confidence on the German side leads directly to one final question. What did the bazooka's sudden dominance mean for the future of warfare itself? The bazooka's story is more than a tale of metal pierced and tanks destroyed. It is the story of how a single, ingeniously simple weapon reshaped the psychology of warfare. By 1944, German tank crews had faced every conceivable threat: artillery, mines, air attack, but nothing undermined their confidence like a handheld launcher operated by a soldier lying prone in a hedgerow. The weapon turned terrain into an ally, technology into a force multiplier, and fear into a strategic tool. In the hedgerows of Normandy, the forests of Italy, and later across Western Europe, the bazooka proved that mobility, size, and armor alone no longer guaranteed battlefield supremacy. Its effectiveness lay not just in physics, but in perception. Armored crews, trained to dominate, were now forced to second-guess every corner, every farm wall, every abandoned building. Confidence fractured, hesitation grew, and German doctrine, built on rapid armored exploitation, was forced into retreat or caution. Beyond its immediate impact, the bazooka set a precedent for post-war military thinking. It demonstrated that small, portable, and technologically precise weapons could neutralize even the most formidable conventional forces. Infantry regained relevance against tanks, shaping modern doctrines of combined arms, urban warfare, and portable anti-armor systems. The weapon foreshadowed the rise of shoulder-fired missiles and guided rockets, tools that would continue to redefine armored combat for decades. And yet, in the quiet aftermath, the lesson was human as much as mechanical. Warfare is never solely about steel and firepower. It is about perception, fear, adaptability, and the courage to wield new tools against the familiar. The bazooka's sudden appearance forced both sides to confront this truth. The future of combat favors those who innovate, anticipate, and respect the unexpected. For the crews of the Panzer divisions, the bazooka was a moment of stark revelation. For the Allied infantry, it was empowerment in the most harrowing of environments. And for history, it was a signal. A small tube of metal and explosive could, in seconds, melt more than armor. It could melt assumptions, doctrine, and the confidence of the battlefield itself. The age of unstoppable armor had met its match, not in overwhelming force, but in precision, ingenuity, and the courage of a few hidden soldiers armed with a bazooka.